My name's Bill Slee, and I want to talk as part of Aberdeenshire's Third Sector Week about the importance and economic value of the voluntary sector. Just a bit about myself. I worked for 25 years or so in Aberdeen at the university and the James Hutton Institute, and in that time I felt very much as though I just slept in the village of Afford where I lived. Such was the necessary commitment to work. But since I retired 5 years ago, what's really become apparent to me is just how important the voluntary sector is. Yes, in economic terms, but in economic ways that are often extremely difficult to measure. I'm a board member of the Mar Area Partnership, which is a key agency in disseminating good practice in community development. I'm a trustee of Afford Men's Shed, and I'll talk a bit about that later, and of Murray Park Trust, which is nearly 100 acres of community woodland on the edge of Afford. And I'm also involved in the Macaulay Development Trust. So I've really become immersed in the third sector in my retirement. But when we start thinking about who provides goods and services, we often have a very simplistic view of the public sector and the private sector. And yes, they're both important, but they're not the whole picture. The market and the private sector provide most of the goods and services that we need money for, and they provide them through market rules. And the state at various levels, from the local council to the regional level health boards to the national level, trunk roads for example, they're really important providers of infrastructure services, social services, educational services, health services and so on. And then there's the third sector, which is not always just social enterprise, but is charities doing charitable work, and a diverse and complex sector that we'll look at the composition of a little later. And we shouldn't forget a fourth sector, household self-provision of services, whether it's households growing their own food or relatives engaging in caring for elderly members of the family. And who provides what service is a function partly of the characteristics of the good or service. Is it something that is naturally a private good or naturally a public good, which throws it to the market or the state? But it's also a function of contemporary political and cultural values and economic forces. In the past, almost everyone was cared for in their retirement and when they were elderly by relatives. But that's much less the case today. But it's still the case in Greece or southern Italy and many other countries. At the moment, I would argue that we're in a time of enormous flux, partly because of European politics and Brexit and populism, also because of COVID, and at the same time we face some really big challenges like climate change, like the cost and how we manage to cope with an ageing population. But let's ask again, where does the third sector fit into this changing and challenged world? And at one level, it's often just seen as a plugger of the gaps, working under the radar and behind the scenes, delivering service where other bits can't because it's not profitable, or where even the public sector can't afford to deliver service to certain places. But the third sector is much, much more than that. It's a living laboratory of experiment and practice seeking to address these unresolved problems. It's a place where people are constantly pushing for new ways of doing things that provide better service or provide service where service has failed. And it's also a place of transition from social movements that are pushing for change to delivering new social and economic practices. And it's hugely significant in both the most challenged places, the most remote communities, the most poor communities, but also in better off communities, in enriching the quality of life in multiple ways. And what does it include? It includes voluntary sports clubs, youth groups that are uniformed and others, conservation trusts, all sorts of groups dealing with well-being for those with disability, gendered groups, women's institutes and so on, religious groups, groups like Afford Community Transport, which I'd never heard of as a car driver, but it voluntarily takes people to hospital visits in Aberdeen when they've got appointments, and when the taxi costs £60 each way, these volunteers will take somebody to an appointment for the cost of the petrol. And we have craft groups and repair workshops and men's sheds where elderly guys can come together and socialise, repair things, mend things, be constructive. Food groups in allotments, COVID volunteer groups running food banks and food delivery services, all kinds of heritage groups like the wonderful Portsoy Community Enterprise with many aspects of boat and sea culture that it brings together in an annual festival. And I'll talk later about that. And then all sorts of sectoral groups, tourism associations, young farmers groups, and so on and so forth. So it's an incredibly diverse sector. But systems of provision and where the third sector fits in is increasingly complicated, and I would say increasingly hybrid. If we look at change for a moment, electricity production was private until the 1940s, and there was a municipal element partly, but mostly it was private. Then it was nationalised and became public. Then it became private. Now we have this hybridity that's emerged. We have private sector providers of electricity. We have community energy as increasingly important. And many of us have solar panels or various forms of renewables associated with our homes. And now the public sector can again engage in energy production and supply. And the different component parts of these systems behave very differently. Large-scale electricity production is about corporate profit. Community energy production is about providing revenue streams that support community development. So they're both producing electricity, but they have hugely different consequences, and we need to understand those. And I've spent part of my research career investigating this very problem. But let's move on and try and think about the economic impacts of the third sector. What are the measurement challenges that we face? Well, how do we value outputs that are often not paid for in any conventional way? If we value that trip from Afford to Aberdeen to a hospital appointment, then do we value it at the opportunity cost, which is the taxi service or a bus that would take all day? Or do we value it at the actual cost of petrol spent? Or how do we value the time of the driver, and so on and so forth? So we can think about the cost to the alternative market or state provider of that service. But there are quality differences between getting on a bus at 6:30 for an appointment at 10:30 in Aberdeen and then getting home late in the afternoon, because that's the frequency of bus services. Compare that with being taken to the appointment, the person waits there, you get back in their car and you're taken home. A second thing we should think about is local multipliers. If money is earned from community energy and it stays in a community, there's a large chance that it'll be spent there. If it's generated by Vattenfall or Scottish and Southern or one of the major producers, it'll go to shareholders, who may or may not be local and in many cases certainly won't be. So we need to think too about local impact and how much that money circulates around the local economy. And that's why community energy is seen as so important. And we also need to think about the cost effectiveness of the service and what it's delivering in terms of benefits. The Social Value Lab in Glasgow has conducted an annual census over the last 3 years of social enterprise, and that's only one bit of the third sector in Scotland. There are over 6,000 social enterprises operating in Scotland. There are 88,000 full-time equivalent employees, and it contributes £2.3 billion gross value added to the Scottish economy. Well over half of them are led by women. A third of them are located in rural Scotland. And so on. So we can see many of them are social enterprises selling direct to consumers. "75% of them pay at least a living wage to their employers. Many of them are incorporated, formal Scottish charitable incorporated organisations. Many of them deliver public contract services. And the total annual income of these social enterprises is £4.4 billion a year in Scotland, and of which £3.1 billion is raised from trading activity. So they're extraordinarily important parts of the Scottish economy, and the Scottish Government has recognised this in Community Empowerment Acts and so on. Let's look just at 3 examples, one of which I'm very familiar with, others of which I have looked at in some detail in the past. Aberdeen District Men's Shed, one of many men's sheds that have sprung up in Aberdeenshire. We took over some land for allotments and community gardens and part of the derelict Afford Academy after it had moved to a new site. We've injected something like £300,000 into that building, of which £245,000 was won by grants from central government, about £15,000 coming from the local council, and about £30,000 of European money, £30,000 of charitable investment, and then nearly £30,000 again of private investment from people in the village. What's it given us? Probably one of the greenest and best men's sheds in Scotland. Most of our contracts have gone to local firms. That gives you that high multiplier, money flowing around the local economy. Thousands of hours of volunteering have reduced costs and created meaningful social activity for the volunteers. From June to September this year, we produced more than 1.5 tonnes of fresh, healthy food on our allotments and in our community polytunnel. Afford had waited decades for allotment. The third sector was able to provide them when the council hadn't. And we've carried out all sorts of repairs and refurbishment of valued personal items at low or zero cost. Repairs to bits of furniture or trinkets that really matter to people, and that can be repaired by really skilled guys who have had a career in furniture making or teaching technical subjects or whatever. And there's been voluntary work that we've undertaken for local schools, making raised beds for their gardens, giving lessons to the school on climate change and so on. So it's a hugely diverse range of activity and a hugely enriching activity for its membership. Next example is a much more singular project, a community energy one, Braemar Community Hydro, in a very dynamic village with a very strong development trust. As a project, they'd known about a hydro plant that existed in the past and there was scope for restoration. But it wasn't sufficiently financially interesting to interest the landowner or even major electricity companies. What it was proposed as was by an early chair of the Development Trust as a potential source of funding, because development trusts are forever looking for funds to develop projects. If they've got their own source of income, it gives them resilience, which they wouldn't otherwise have. And Braemar Community Hydro was able to raise £800,000 of capital, most of that locally through crowdsourcing, and it's now run as a community benefit society. Generated operating profit last year of £97,000 and gave benefits to a range of community groups of £10,000 in this last year, and it will increase to £20,000 next year. Volunteers help keep the equipment in good condition, and those who have invested through the crowdsourcing receive about 3.5% interest on their investment. So it's a win-win all round. The community gains hugely, the investors have gained as well, and what you've got is a vibrant organisation of interested people who are running a very effective income-generating enterprise, but it's a third sector enterprise. My last example is Port Soy. Port Soy Community Enterprise, again a development trust. Over 20 years ago, they had a one-off festival to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the port. It's become an annual event with up to 16,000 visitors. And the whole project works collaboratively. The organisation is aimed at providing economic benefit from tourism for the town of Port Soy and its surrounding areas. There have been huge capital investments, a really wonderful bunkhouse has been developed in the last few years. They have a museum, they have a traditional boat building shed that involves kids from Banff Academy. The whole festival and what has happened as a result of the third sector has this huge multiplier effect on the local economy, increasing turnover. But there's a huge input from volunteers whose lives are enriched by that process. So whether it's tourism, whether it's energy, whether it's social events and social activity for elderly men, we can see the social sector having really important impacts on the communities. They're economic impacts, but it's more than economics. It's about social well-being and a different kind of way of doing things. What do these examples, though, have in common? Firstly, the third sector has much greater ability to access capital grants that aren't available to private sector, and indeed quite often not available to public sector operators as well. What they have in common is that there's nearly always a strong stock of human capital, people in those communities that are devoted to make that enterprise vibrant and resilient and deliver benefits to the community. And there's a strong desire in all these three cases to develop a business model where you don't need to keep running for grant income somewhere else, and you can reduce grant dependency by having income generation. Solar panels on the men's shed, Braemar Community Hydro, or the bunkhouse to help underpin the boat festival. And I think what they also have, and we often neglect this, is an ability to deliver service far more effectively than either the private or the public sector doing the same thing. There's a lack of institutional red tape, much less top-heavy bureaucracy. There's no need for profit. There's high levels of reinvestment in the community. And what you're doing all the time is building human and social capital in place-based communities where people know each other better and work together to achieve local benefit. So if we try and conclude, what can we conclude? If we're looking at the overall value of the third sector to society, it goes far, far beyond economic metrics. But even on economic metrics alone, the voluntary sector is hugely important for Scotland and hugely important for Aberdeenshire. But it's not about profit. It's about really the third sector delivering well-being. And it's about the third sector's capacity to improve the quality of places. And it's unrivalled in this by other sectors. And if you want to see examples of just how important the third sector is, COVID, I think, has shown us that. It showed us that you can reach out to the most disadvantaged people, those who are isolated, those who need food parcels to survive. And the third sector is incredibly capable in plugging those widening gaps in service delivery where the market has failed and public sector cannot reach them. But beyond that, the third sector is also a waymarker to a post-carbon world. We see climate challenge groups all around Scotland. Tarland's had them. Afford is operating a group at the moment. There are groups up in Banff that are all looking at how we're going to adapt to a post-carbon age. And Aberdeenshire has been so dominated by oil and gas that it needs to learn that the world is overheating and we have to do something about it. And that third sector must grow in importance as we substitute well-being values for GDP. And we've seen our First Minister in Scotland arguing for a greater emphasis on well-being. And so, in conclusion, Third Sector Week should be about empowering communities to deliver better services, to deliver well-being, and to deliver services at a value that can't be reached by the private sector and can't be reached by the public sector, because volunteers and local skilled operators have that sense of loyalty and engagement with place that we simply don't find most of the time in those other sectors. Thank you very much.